Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science.
Will, it kind of looked like you just put a big old cicada in your mouth.
Have you tried them yet? If it's good enough for the turkeys, it's good enough for me.
I grilled some cicada bobs last night. Not very good.
Yeah. Well, we've been talking about
really
this
crunchy.
big hatch coming since last summer, and it's here. You know, we were just talking about before we went live that I was on a property a little north of the Talladega National Forest yesterday, and they were deafening.
Yeah.
With protein packets everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. Well, I also want to reiterate again, I'm excited about it because if we see an increase in productivity, we know that part of the productivity problems at least are linked to insect abundance, and we can affect that through habitat management.
Yeah.
We know that pretty well. And it's probably going to be relevant to some of the things we talk about today with pine management.
Yeah. So that's definitely one of the biggest pieces of listener feedback that I feel like we've gotten over the past few months, is especially from that survey. And thanks again to everybody that completed that. But it was clear that everybody wanted to hear more about habitat management topics. And we're at a time of the year right now where, you know, turkey season is winding down or has just recently ended in a lot of states. And folks are thinking about, you know, what they can do to make things better next year.
Yeah.
So we've got,
related to the survey
talk about that here today.
Yeah, sorry, didn't mean to.
No, you're good.
cut you off, but regarding the survey, it not only came up several times. I mean, probably the most dominant topic was habitat management, but it came up several times specific to pine management,
right?
Like pine plantation management for turkeys.
Yeah, and one thing that I do want to throw in here is that, you know, even if you're in a part of the country that does not have a lot of pine plantation, the overarching principles that we're going to talk about today, as far as the relationship between canopy closure, you know, understory disturbance, and wild turkeys, hold pretty consistently across a variety of cover types. So there's, you know, don't necessarily count this episode out as one that's not going to be very informative in your neck of the woods.
Yeah, matter of fact, I just completed yesterday a webinar that had people. It was hosted in Wisconsin, but it had people from all over the world interested in it. It even applies across species, you know, and continents even. But I was talking about these same principles, and I was relating it to turkey management, particularly in the eastern United States, but it applies, you know, pretty much across their range. So
yeah. So let's get right into it. And we're excited today to have Ted DeVos with us. And Ted has been featured on Fire University before. This is his first time on Turkey Science, but Ted has a background in both forestry and wildlife. And he is co-owner of Bach and DeVos Forestry Services. And Ted, we're glad you joined us today. Excited about having you on and discussing some of these topics with you.
Absolutely. Appreciate it. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, we do appreciate it. And I also know that you love turkeys. So I can appreciate that.
Yeah, you guys are putting a little damper on me since I couldn't go out this morning. I had to be here in time to do this thing. So y'all owe me.
Yeah, I tried to get it scheduled in the afternoon, Ted, but Will wouldn't allow it. He just
put it off on me.
I felt like maybe that was intentional on Will's part.
Well, Ted's been having a better season than I have, so I'm just trying to drag him down to my level.
Oh, okay. Is that what's happening?
It's been a struggle in season, I can say that much.
Yeah, it has for us to a degree as well. You know, we talked about that, I think, on the last episode a little bit. But Yeah. So what we were kind of thinking today, Ted, is a lot of our listeners in particular are interested in this topic of, pine management. We've got a lot of listeners from the South. And so the way that we were thinking about kind of structuring this is going through the decisions that are made during the early part, the middle part, and then the late part of a pine rotation, and what is typically done from a forest products perspective to, produce fiber. And then, the alternatives that might be implemented that improve turkey habitat at each stage, and the trade-offs that would be associated with each of those. So
Sure.
can we start out by talking a little bit about, we've got an area, it's recently been clear cut, probably in the past year or two. And so we're planning on preparing that site, site preparation. A lot of people refer to it as site prep. What are the steps that are typically going to be taken, and why?
Well, when you've got a fresh clear cut, obviously, your big trees have been removed, and so you're starting at ground zero. Historically, which may have, something to do with wildlife populations, certainly quail and stuff like that. Historically, when we didn't have the herbicides we've got now, let's say in the 50s and 60s and prior to that, I mean, it was all mechanical, which is kind of interesting to think about too. So some of these plantations we're working in now might not have ever had herbicide applications in the past, but nowadays, they're going straight to herbicide application. So if you're timber management on a TMO or something like that, and you're focused primarily on growing fiber, you're doing a pretty intensive herbicide application. And if you're doing, from a wildlife perspective, you may be a little bit more sensitive about how much and what species of chemicals you're applying, where you don't just nuke out all of your legumes and forbs and things like that. With the clientele we work with is primarily, combination of timber and wildlife folks. And, that's kind of what we specialize in, is integrating that wildlife perspective into a timber management thing. We're going to go probably more on the more lenient side of herbicide applications. Enough herbicide in the right species to, knock out sweet gums, things like that, and inhibit the growth of stuff for a year or so, but not enough to turn the species composition out there to, just broom straw, which you do see on industrial lands where, most of the good plants have been killed out and what's left is just broom straw. So,
Yeah.
Ted, when they're using a broad scale herbicide application, what herbicide is used? Is there one that's typical, or are there multiple options?
there are multiple options. You're probably going to have a imazapyr in just about every mix, arsenal type chemicals or whatever, generic might come off of that. That's going to be very common, and at high rates, that really inhibits the growth of stuff for quite a while, and it's soil active as well as foliar active.
So that's soil residual activity on most hardwood species.
And then you got stuff like Escort, metsulfuron methyl. That's going to be knocking back a lot of your blackberries and things like that, and legumes. There may be some oust in there, which that's actually the mix that we use typically on our site preps. We use a little bit of imazapyr, a little bit of glyphosate, Roundup chemical, a little bit of Escort type chemical to control the blackberries, and then a little bit of oust, to give you a little residual control the following spring to keep, things like dog fennel and ragweed down a little bit for the following year. But if you use them at the lower rates, then you still have that recovery period. And 2 years down the road, let's say on a longleaf plantation, and you get your first burn on it 2 years down the road, you still have a really nice composition of forbs and legumes and stuff growing out there, in with the broom straw, and you got good recovery in following years. But there's no doubt that some of these more industrial sites that are, really laying the herbicide to it, there's several years that there's nothing out there but broom straw, maybe a couple of the more herbicide tolerant weeds that grow out there, and there's just not much left out there but broom straw and a pine tree, which
that's the intent.
It is their intent, correct?
Yeah.
Yep.
Because it's growing fiber.
Yep.
So is that the main adjustment that you guys make from site prepping a site where timber production would be a higher priority versus wildlife habitat objectives is backing off on the rates, but using the same chemicals?
I would say that's probably accurate.
Okay.
And because we want to get that flush of forbs and legumes and other weeds and stuff like that growing in that stand as soon as possible. Now, again, if you're dealing with longleaf, where you're going to be burning pretty quick versus loblolly, it may not be quite as important. If you let your loblolly shade out after 4 or 5 years and you got 100% shade on the ground, it doesn't really matter what you've done previous to that, because you got shady ground cover anyway. But if you're trying to get a regular fire through it on a longleaf stand, you'd like to retain that forb weed base as long as possible, and the grasses, of course.
Right. Yeah. So I used to be of the mindset that I greatly preferred an arsenal AC only site prep or mid rotation release, when that work is done too. And I know we'll get to that in just a little while, because it tends to be more legume friendly. It tends to leave the blackberry behind. But I've increasingly moved over towards appreciating what you get from the addition of the escort, because in a lot of those arsenal only stands, whether they're sprayed at site prep or at mid rotation, it's good to retain some blackberry, but oftentimes you retain way too much blackberry. And so you have like the skidder trails and the take rows that are just these mounds of impenetrable blackberry thicket. And we want some of that, but like we always say and have said many times on this show, really diversity is what we're after. We don't want too much of any particular plant type. And then the other thing that I've noticed is if you leave the escort out, especially like on Piedmont sites throughout the South, I've seen a lot of winged elm come back when the escort's not added, and it casts a lot of shade that inhibits plant growth in the understory.
That's why I like escort. I've dealt with the winged elm problem much more.
And blackberry can be pretty hard. It's a burn inhibitor. There's days when you're just amazed at how much blackberry is being burned, but there's more days when you're looking at blackberry as something that is some pseudo fire break within your stand. And if you're an old fat guy like me trying to walk through a 5-year-old longleaf stand and walk it out with a drip torch through blackberries, you're just cussing the fact that you didn't put enough escort out there to control those things. It can get really tough to get into the stand and get it to burn when you've got too many blackberries. And there's some sites are really intense and they just develop blackberries really well. Some sites not so much.
Right.
So Ted, we've been talking about the variations on applying different chemicals and what you're achieving with that. Are there instances where you might recommend to a landowner they not use any herbicide in that site prep?
If it has a history of being, having some herbicide on it. So for instance, something that, was managed as an open piney woods or something like that, and it's already had some arsenal being used out there to control sweet gums and, smaller sprouts and saplings. Yeah, you could probably get away with some minimizing herbicide, so maybe not some arsenal, because you don't have the woody control that you need, the woody species that you need to control. And depends on what you're planting too. Loblolly is going to tolerate, it's going to grow out of that stage where it gets over top of the competition a lot faster than longleaf, which is going to linger, in a shorter stage for longer periods of time. You got to control that stuff with fire. So yeah, if it's had a history of it and it's going back to loblolly, you could probably get away with, or at least minimizing some of the herbicides.
Yeah. But I do think that one thing that's important for landowners to keep in mind too is one of the uphill battles that we're always fighting in, forest management for wildlife is oftentimes we want to take that forest down to a woodland or a savanna condition, which means it has a more open canopy. And as soon as you open up that canopy, things want to grow.
Absolutely.
And one of the things that you're facing in particular when trying to manage for turkey habitat is you want most of that understory vegetation to be grasses or forbs, with in particular emphasis on forbs. And so we're fighting against that woody competition, all those hardwood resprouts. In the South, the main one is sweet gum. So I've also, while we want to be cognizant of the plants that we potentially reduce or eliminate in an area with an intensive site prep, we also don't necessarily want to forego that, because we could end up with a situation later on down the road where our understory is completely invaded with hardwood stems that are relatively low value to turkeys.
Yep.
So there's a little bit of a balancing act there. Yeah.
Yeah, the whole thing, which is kind of the entertainment part of it, doing this kind of work, is it's all a balancing act. Everything you're doing out there is you're trying to encourage this and discourage that, whether through chemicals, fire, sunlight, whatever the case might be. Everything's just kind of, walking that knife edge. And sweet gums are one of those. I don't mind sweet gums in a regularly burned pine stand, but I don't want it to be my dominant understory hardwood, and same with shrubbery, wax myrtles, things like that. You like them out there, but you don't like them taking over. An interesting one is always, what is that? There's that bush got the purple berries.
Beautyberry.
Beautyberry, man. So beautyberry on certain sites is a great shrub, and on certain sites, beautyberry is a plant that we have to figure out how to control. I mean, it will go in there and dominate an understory of pretty quail woods, and it's just a solid beautyberry stand underneath it, even on 2-year burn rotation. It's just amazing.
Yeah, and I feel like you used to see that a lot more when hexazinone was commonly a site prep chemical that was used. Ultra lightweight and Velspar, I think, both had it. And you would see stands just completely overtaken by beautyberry shortly after application of those.
Yeah.
So, Ted, I told you before the show, but one thing that I have been encountering, I wouldn't say over and over, but relatively frequently, is people have inherited or bought a property that has recently had intensive site prep followed by planting of loblolly seedlings. And their question to me is what can they do with it? They're interested in turkeys and not in timber at all. Someone else planted those pines, and they're wanting to know about burning. So can you talk to us a little bit about, the differences, I guess, in loblolly and longleaf and burning early? I know you talked about that a little bit a few minutes ago with burning longleaf, a couple of years after they're planted.
Yeah. We run into all that kind of stuff in some places where, you got longleaf that somebody wants to burn early and soon. And sometimes, folks are not that interested in doing it at all. And loblolly is in the same scenario. Most folks are scared of burning loblolly before it's, 8 or 9 years old, 30 feet tall, something like that, where it's out of that range of being impacted by the fires. We burned some 5-year-old stuff last week, and burned it late in the afternoon, tried to catch that window between, it was still pretty dry during the day, and as the sun was setting, the humidities were coming up. We tried to get a whole bunch of it burned during an hour or so time frame. And you
were doing that to try to keep down the fire intensity?
We were doing that because as a quail guy that, wants to have some openness under his young loblolly. Sure. And this was basically
I mean, in terms of the techniques you were using.
Oh, yes, trying to keep the intensity down, yes.
Yeah, y'all do a lot of night burning of young lob plantation, don't you?
If we're burning really young stuff, a lot of it's at night, yeah.
Yeah.
And I've still got some.
Let that fire creep.
Yep. I've still got some on the list. I don't know if we're going to get to it or not because our temperatures are now getting up in the 80s during the day, and even at night it's not cooling down as much as it was a month ago. But so yeah, you can get a fire through these younger stands. You got to be careful with the 5 or 6 year old stuff. But if you catch the conditions right and get a creeper fire late in the afternoon, sometimes they'll burn all the way through the night. As long as it's secure, you can just, you get your boundaries secure and make sure that fire's not going to get out on you, creep bottoms and fire lanes, and light a couple spots on some ridges. And that thing may spend the whole night just kind of creeping down a hill. Patience is the virtue on that one. Because if you try and, burn up, even the guys who say that they don't care about the trees, don't want them all killed. That's kind of what we found. The other general rule is if you've paid for them, and you have a fire in there that if you've already paid for them, they're probably going to die. If you hadn't paid for them, you don't really care about them, they're probably going to live. And or if it's in loblolly and longleaf stand, if you're trying to get rid of those 3-year-olds, you can't hardly burn them hot enough to get rid of them. But if they're trees that you'd like to keep out there, a small fire just kills the stew out of them. But yeah, it's just a matter of being slow and careful, get the right conditions. It's really particular about the conditions you're trying to burn under, whether or not you're going to do a good job of burning out a loblolly stand. There's benefits to it. You get those blackberries under control, you get the fuel load down, open it up a little bit, get some grasses, in there where turkeys will start nesting in it, and birds will feel more comfortable moving through a stand sooner, when you can get a fire on it earlier.
And Ted, I know that we've had this conversation before, but you feel, for our listeners, you feel like when you get a couple of burns prior to the first thin, that the understory responds better after that thin too, right?
Yeah, there's a couple of benefits to doing burns prior to first thinning. So let's say a stand gets to 14 and it's old enough, to be thinned and material's big enough. There's, one, it's cleaner. So it's better for loggers to be able to see what they're cutting when they're trying to thin. And if we're marking it or whatever, it allows us to get through the stand. So, burning it once, or even better, twice prior to that 14-year stage. So let's say you burn it at 13 and then you burned it earlier at 10. Something like that is pretty much ideal. You've got a good clean site. It doesn't have the sweet gum issues and stuff. You've controlled those with fire and herbicides, of course. So you're not dealing with the vines and the saplings and the underbrush that, you try to get out of there, so that, loggers can get in and you can get in it, and wildlife are going to use it a little bit better. And then post thin, once that stuff's been, run through, they've done their corridors and they've thinned a little bit between the corridors, then you don't have, one, a fuel load, so your first burn's going to be a little bit easier. And two, all that brush and stuff has been controlled on those fires, so you've got a pretty nice clean stand to work with after you're done, thinning it. And it just makes for a neater job and easier to clean up and get productive again. Your legumes and forbs and stuff have kind of been prepped up to be growing out there, the grasses, through that burning, process. So it just recovers a lot nicer and easier, I think.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. So I want to go back to our site prep discussion for just a minute. So, this stand is a site's been harvested. We've site prepped it with a chemical, and we talked about some things that we might do to our chemical prescription when we're prioritizing turkeys versus other objectives. So kind of, can you walk us through what happens from there in terms of the stand's development, and then also turkey use during those first several years?
That's going to be different, loblolly versus longleaf, of course.
Sure.
So, if we separate those two out and then go with an industrial timber stand, management regime where they do an intensive site prep, and there has been a tendency for them to be planting at higher densities. That's changing a little bit. Some of these industrial sites are starting to plant at lower densities, which
more trees per acre, in other words.
Well, less. So
they're moving toward less.
They're moving toward less, and they're moving towards a higher quality, faster growing seedling. Okay. So they're the more expensive seedlings, the clone-ish type stuff that's a little bit higher genetic stock, and those trees are super fast growing. So they may be planting. So let's say in the past they were planting at 700 trees per acre, which is pretty high rate, and once that site was site prepped, you get 2 or 3 years of, grass and forb, whatever weed growth in there, that turkeys could use to nest in. Maybe the first year or two, maybe a little bit of bugging, although with the intensive site prep, probably not, because there's not a whole lot of weeds growing in there. And then after that, this thing starts canopying out pretty quick. Nowadays, with, let's say, 400 seedlings per acre, it probably takes a little bit longer. There's still a canopy closure, but instead of being 3 or 4 years of age, it might be 4 or 5 years of age. So you might get another year or so out of it. But those fast growing trees do canopy close pretty quickly. So once that gets to that thicker, stage of 4 or 5 years of age, I don't think there's going to be much use of, turkeys other than skate cover. There's just a protective place they can go get into if they're being chased by a hawk or something like that. Until, you get to first thins. So there's a big gap in there. With the longleaf, it's a little bit different scenario, of course. Go ahead.
Yeah, Ted, when would the first thin be typically? Like what?
In our neck of the
what
woods,
age?
it's 14. That's
Okay.
that's almost a whole nother subject of going into what the timber markets are doing. Timber markets
So
they're so squirrely right now,
yeah,
and then of course that depends on if it's a stand that was planted, but you had a lot of natural seedlings in it, and so now you're looking at 1,000 stem per acre stands. Another benefit of burning, to keep those stands under a reasonable density. But if you're looking at 1,000 stem per acre stand, it might not be thinnable until it's 15, 16, even 17 years old because there's too much competition between stems. And
yeah,
again, one of the reasons I think the timber companies are going to a lower density with a faster growing tree, they can get that to be thinnable age or clear cut if they're just cutting it for pulpwood at 12, so they're starting to cut back on the rotation times to be able to get into that thing for a first thin.
okay. So you were saying that about under that intensive site prep with fast growing trees at lower density
They can
For
thin it
loblaw.
earlier now with loblaw.
for loblaw. Yeah,
Yeah.
we're having to qualify a lot.
Yeah.
You've got a 2 or 3 year period up front where turkeys might have some use in it, particularly nesting at 2 or 3 or 4 years
Yeah.
into that. Then at about 5, it's starting to canopy out. We're closed canopy, and the structure's not really usable for turkeys until that first thin,
Correct.
which would be an 8 to 10 year period, it sounds like.
Probably about right.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure we're following you with the timeline.
Well, and again, the industrial forestry kind of gets a bad rap, and some of that's deserved from a wildlife perspective, because of those things like intensive site prep that changes that vegetation structure so drastically and doesn't allow much from the wildlife, perspective. There's not much weeds and forbs and legumes and stuff out there, and their idea is trying to get that canopy closed as fast as possible, capture all the sunlight on the site. And if they get to a point where they're, clear cutting at, let's say 15, and you got a 15-year rotation of, site prep, planting, clear cut, site prep, planting, clear cut on a 15-year rotation, that's going to wreak havoc, I think, on wildlife populations and certainly turkeys.
Yeah, I mean, because you're only getting any wildlife or any turkey habitat for a couple of years out of every 15.
Exactly. And they're not to that point yet, but they're certainly headed that way because their rotations are getting shorter and they're more interested in straight fiber than they are saw logs. So, for instance, we try and encourage a lot of our landowners to, grow that older big pine tree on an open quail woods looking, type of habitat that's broom straw understories, a lot of weeds and forbs and multiple burn rotations, et cetera, and with a low density of pines, and grow that out to a saw timber sized tree that might be 50, 60, 70 years old. If you're talking about longleaf, it might be older than that. And the industry has gotten to where those bigger trees are becoming less valuable. And there's certainly a size class where the mills just say, no, we're not taking it. When you go look at log index now, there's butt cuts all over the place because the trees were too big at the butt to get to the mill for that particular product.
Mm-hmm.
So their size at the mills is actually getting smaller, and that has it's got certainly implications for wildlife and how you manage your timber down the road. There's no question about it.
Mm-hmm. It's amazing how much this has changed just since I have a forestry degree from my undergrad and learned intensive pine agriculture, basically intensive silvicultural practices for industrial pine. And it has changed dramatically in that 15-year roughly period since I went through that program.
Yeah.
Just to give perspective on the timing, like
Yeah.
this is within one rotation of pines, it has changed substantially.
From our perspective, it's certainly not changing for the better. It's getting
Yeah.
harder and harder to
Probably
sell
not for
your timber
turkeys,
and
so.
make money off of it. And it's probably not beneficial for turkeys down the road. So anyway, going back to where we were talking about the early rotation stuff, again, if you're doing longleaf, and talking about that from a wildlife perspective, there's certainly benefits. From a timber's perspective, I don't know. I've seen various forecasts on, timber markets and longleaf, and then you look at old field plantings versus clear cut plantings and the quality of those trees. Are we going to get to that point where we really are growing a really nice, pretty longleaf down the road? On old field sites, that may not be the case because a lot of those are pretty rough looking longleaf. But anyway, from a wildlife habitat perspective and a turkey perspective, you do get huge benefits because you can start going into those longleaf stands. You're planting them at, we like to plant them a little higher density just to keep the trees cleaner as they're growing. And longleaf has a tendency to just slowly but surely die and thin itself over time, especially with fires. But we're burning on a 2 or 3 year return interval. Start at year 2. If the fuel's not there, start at year 3, and then try and get back in that stand every second or third year to burn it. And you could extend that life of turkey use, I don't know, without mechanical thinning, it may be 20 years really before you get to that point where the canopy's closed enough that it really inhibits the growth of understory plants, broom straws and forbs and legumes. At 20, that should be about ready for thinning, and they should be kind of canopy closed. So a really good site with a good stocking density is probably going to canopy close 15 years, and then it's just pine straw on the ground. But that's a good 15 years of life where you get at least some value out of it, and maybe for a couple of years before full canopy closure, it's weak, but it's still got some understory habitat. And then you've got that.
So you're still seeing turkey use in those stands for that whole.
Even
if you're burning,
it's interesting that the canopy closure on longleaf looks different than canopy closure on loblolly in general. Longleaf needles are bigger, they're fluffier, they tend to lodge up and make little nesting sites and things like that. So we've seen turkeys nesting in some fairly closed canopy, fluffy fuel longleaf sites. Is it ideal? Probably not. But do they use it? Yeah, they'll certainly use it, I think, better than a loblolly stand. And again, both of those are going to depend on whether your burn return interval is fairly regular or not. In loblolly that hadn't been burned before, it's going to look a lot different than loblolly that's been burned twice. At canopy closure.
Yeah. So Ted, you were saying with longleaf, somewhere between 15 and 20 would hit canopy closure. Is that right?
Yeah, I'd say so.
Fire return interval. And when would the first thinning usually occur? Like, what's the time window?
You would hope it's around 20. You'd hope at that time frame that.
Okay, so you're trying to thin about when the canopy closure is occurring.
Yeah, but it's so different than loblolly. I mean, because there is just a natural dropping out of trees over time in longleaf stand that you don't see as much of in loblolly. We always say longleaf are just looking for a good reason to die, and they tend to find it. So you might have planted it at 600 trees per acre, and you never killed one with a direct hot fire or something like that. And by 20 years old, you may have 450. They've just fallen out over time. So they do tend to naturally thin themselves, I think.
Yeah, and once you go in with a commercial thin at 20-ish, give or take a handful of years, then you're extending the life again with turkey use.
Absolutely. And obviously for both.
That sounds like a pretty good deal.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, and you can layer on top of that there's, federal funding available to help landowners plant longleaf in many cases.
Yeah, in some areas. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm afraid that there wouldn't be much longleaf planted without it.
Yeah.
Not in our neck of the woods.
Right.
Yeah. What?
Just because of the decreased profitability.
Yes. Yeah.
But you were saying that the loblolly is decreasing profitability anyway. So
That-
are they getting closer together in terms of what you would make
well, I mean,
timber wise, or are they both
without
falling
cost share,
precipitously?
longleaf wasn't a particularly profitable thing to begin with, unless you're in, a really good longleaf site. If you're down in, Brewton area in South Alabama or something like that, in places where they got a lot of experience with, longleaf management, and they have the mills to handle, good quality logs. They're specialized in some of that, some export materials and stuff like that. But if you're just doing pulpwood and chip and saw timber, peeler logs or something along those lines, there's not much difference between longleaf prices and loblolly prices. None really, in our neck of the woods. So they're falling at the same rate. And now loblolly is going to grow you more product, more wood over time. But if you've got, so which we try and make this argument for landowners or that have an interest in wildlife. If you've got multiple interests on your property, you want aesthetics, you want to have wildlife habitat out there, and you kind of like longleaf or whatever for the natural history standpoint. There's a lot of good arguments for planting and growing longleaf, and some of our landowners, plant it without cost share. But it's landowners that have a strong wildlife interest, and if you're into it strictly for money making purposes from a timber standpoint, you're probably not going to have many deer, turkeys, and quail. You're not going to have any quail, but you ain't going to have many turkeys either, because those two don't overlap that well. There certainly is a lot of overlap, but they don't overlap that well. The straight timber guys that want to make money off timber, it's an industrial crop, and they don't have much wildlife habitat. You see it on industrial lands all over the place. Short rotation, high density, canopy closure quick, and the wildlife guys are obviously on the other side of the spectrum. And they realize there's not as much money in growing timber. Now, can they sell their property for a higher rate? Absolutely. So these guys that are growing industrial timberlands trying to sell something that's a 20-year-old pine stand that's still carrying 500 trees per acre and is canopy closed, there's value on timber, but that dirt value is going to be lower than the guy who's got a manicured piece of property that's burned and thinned, and he's got some big pines and quail woods, and he's got some planted, stands and diversified piece of property. His dirt price is probably twice, what that industrial price is.
Here's another thing too that I think, as natural resource management professionals, that we're really good at doing, and something that landowners are really good at doing, is calculating, or at least thinking about, what is the revenue that I'm giving up by implementing this habitat management practice versus, doing it this other way. So the, perfect case in point, loblolly versus longleaf. But what I think we don't do as good a job doing as the professionals or as the landowners is thinking about, okay, well, we did the math and we found out that by going with loblolly, we're going to get a quicker return. It may be the same return, but it's going to happen faster, right? Versus prolonging that and waiting for it longer with longleaf. However, keep in mind though, you need to put a value too on the turkeys that are going to be potentially produced in a longleaf stand over that period of time versus a loblolly stand over that time, and put a value on the fact that you're going to have a higher quality hunting experience and probably encounter more turkeys on a property. Especially, think about a situation where we've got a 25-acre stand on a 100-acre property. Well, if we go with loblolly pine, there's about a 15-year period that you're only going to get 3 years of use out of. Whereas over that same time period with longleaf instead, you've got 15 years of use, basically, is the way Ted just explained it.
Yeah, no question.
Yeah, and we also don't know what the difference in productivity of the turkey population would be, or other species.
No, we don't.
But it's probably much greater.
Yeah.
So you probably have more of them and higher use is what I'm with you. And I was just thinking through, how would you even quantify that? Well, we can sort of.
Yeah.
People often don't bat an eye at paying $20 an acre per year for access to deer and turkey hunt.
Mm-hmm.
So we can do the math pretty fast to see how much value is that. Of course, that varies by person, but
Yeah.
I agree. With the longleaf model having that extended use and potentially higher productivity, to me, that would carry a lot of value.
That's a lot of the
Ted, one
issue.
thing,
Is trying to quantify all those different variables. Even when you come down to growing a stand at 400 trees per acre versus 600, or good sites versus bad sites, and chip and saw versus pulpwood, and then trying to figure out what a lease value is. What's a turkey worth? I've looked at a couple papers, kind of looking at what are the cost and benefits and opportunity costs associated with managing timber on an open nature quail place type stuff. And I mean, they'll throw some numbers out there and put a value on a quail lease, for instance, but it's almost arbitrary, because the guy that we're working with that wants to have quail woods, he is never going to lease it. And is it worth $10 an acre to him, or is it worth $100 an acre to him? I don't know. Not most, but a lot of our guys are like, look, I've got this property for a hunting property. I want to make money off my timber. I don't want to lose money on it, but I'm making money on whatever. I'm a financial advisor. That's where I'm making my money. This is a recreational tract I bought so that I can enjoy it.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's everybody that contacts me pretty much.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that philosophy is ideal in our scenario. That again, we're trying to grow our loblolly stands and make them productive, but we're incorporating the wildlife aspect to it as well. So when it comes down to it, when we're trying to sell timber, we're trying to get the best price we can. But if we're thinning a chip and saw stand, a 20-year-old stand's already been thinned once, and we're thinning it back, are we going to thin it as much as a industrial, timber company might do and thin it back to a 70 basal area, or are we maybe going to cut it back to a 50, more like the quail woods? We're probably going to cut more like the quail woods. Mm-hmm. Is there a direct opportunity cost to doing that? It's hard to equate that as well. So, one of them, you might be carrying 20% less timber, but you're not making 20% less money. You're probably making 10% less money, because the trees on a more open stand are growing faster. They're probably healthier, so you're not losing as many, the beetles.
And when you layer on the habitat value of that as well, it cuts that 10% down even further. I mean, so maybe it's just a 5% difference.
Yep,
yeah,
exactly.
Depending on what that wildlife value is to a person that would have to go lease it otherwise, or not gain that income, it may actually exceed the value that you lost. You may exceed the other revenues gained, we'll call them.
There's some papers out there that would say that, yes. But I've read a couple of them that say, there's no question that the wildlife value added to the loss in timber, the decline in the timber value of a tract, combine the two together, you end up with a higher value piece of property. And I can make that argument from a real estate perspective as well, that if you're managing a place well, there's no question that recreational tracts sell higher than timber tracts. Mm-hmm. So you figure out what the dirt's worth here and what the dirt's worth there, and this one's got timber and that one's got timber. If one's managed and prettier, there's no question that those higher value recreational tracts are going to sell for a higher price.
Yeah, and if the turkeys are gobbling their face off on it, that
when you show it that day
for me.
Exactly.
Well, I was going to ask you, Ted, if there are lots of landowners or prospective landowners that they are getting the land for recreational value and don't care about the timber nearly as much. They don't necessarily want to throw money away, but
that's right.
In those cases, are you recommending when possible that they replant stands with longleaf then?
On most sites that do, there's places the longleaf doesn't do well. Wetter areas, some of the more fertile sites, maybe loblolly is a better choice. But in most cases, longleaf, if it's in the longleaf zone, longleaf is the choice we try and go to for wildlife perspective, and primarily just because you can burn it earlier and, more regular than
Yeah.
loblolly. So
it's kind of giving you more flexibility to make sure that it's
yes.
high quality wildlife habitat for more of the rotation.
Yeah. Now, if there wasn't cost share, I'm guessing that our longleaf would probably be down by 30%, maybe. We'd probably still do 70% of the ones that are being planted because most of our clientele is a wildlife interest.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it still fits into that regime pretty well. And ultimately down the road, I think people like the local longleaf, and down the road when it's chip and saw and you might get some poles out of it where there may be some financial advantages to growing longleaf, then, people enjoy it a lot more, but it's a pretty long prospect to get there too. I mean, you talk about 30 years before you might see, truly that difference, at least in our neck of the woods, that difference in pole quality wood, compared to loblolly that doesn't have as many poles in it.
Mm-hmm.
So we've talked about thinning several times already. So let's just go ahead and jump into mid rotation and talk about status quo versus more wildlife centric. What we might do there.
Yep. So if you're the industrial timber folks that are just trying to grow wood products, it's pretty normal certainly for a first thin at 14, 15 years of age. And I think their target goal is generally 70 basal area across the board. So even on their first and second thins, 70 basal area is typically the density they're shooting for. And I don't know if y'all ever gotten into explaining, basal area and pine density before, but all that is just an indication of how thick that pine stand is. It's kind of a long explanation, complicated, but anyway.
But it correlates with canopy closure, which we talk about on here a lot.
Yes, exactly. And so I've always used this analogy all the time is that, timber's a crop and people that are trying to grow timber use it as a crop. And the idea is if you've got an acre of land, the way you grow that crop is you capture all the nutrients, the moisture, and the sunlight on that site on the crop that you're trying to grow. So if you're a timber guy, you want that canopy to close back out after you're done thinning it as quick as possible so you can capture all the sunlight, nutrients, and soil moisture on that site to grow that product. If you're a wildlife guy, our product is the understory, lower than your belt in general. And so now we want to open that canopy up and capture that sunlight, nutrients, and soil moisture in those understory plants that we're trying to grow for wildlife, turkey habitat, nesting cover, brood cover, whatever the case might be. So and the industrial guys, when they go in on the first thin, they're going to thin it, fifth row generally, and they'll cut maybe 30% out of the remaining 4 rows, and that'll canopy close in 3 or 4 years. It'll be back to, fairly close canopy. And the only thing that's going to be growing under there is very shade tolerant, trees like sweet gum, pretty shade tolerant, wax myrtles, whatever. And eventually, it'll try and get back to full canopy closure. There's not going to be much weedy, grassy vegetation growing on that site. And obviously that's our issue with, industrial timber management.
So now we're at 15, 20 years post planting, and we've had a combined total of like maybe 6 years of use
at best.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep. And so right after thinning, you might get a year. I mean, I'm not even sure on a 14, 15-year-old stand. It's ugly the first year. It's got a lot of trash on the ground. The second year, some of that stuff starts to mat down. You may get a few grasses and things growing in there, but without a fire, it's a thick, rank site. You might get some turkey nesting around the edges. By the third year, it's closing canopy, and all you've got in there is bushes and trash and pine needles. So there's not much value on that window either. And it changes a little bit when you get to a little bit older age classes. But there are some of these timber companies will do herbicide applications and mid-rotation stuff, aerial fly, arsenal over top of them. It's not uncommon. And some of them might fertilize, again, just trying to grow that pine tree. They don't care about growing whatever else might be out there. So if they do mid-rotation herbicide, that you probably get a little bit of a boost out of it. So they'll first thin it and, maybe apply some arsenal over it. Maybe a little higher rates than we might use, but they're going to apply arsenal over, kill all the sweet gums. They're also killing all the oak trees, oak saplings, and big oak trees that might be scattered through that stand. But you do get a little bit more sunlight penetration for a couple more years, and you might get some broom straw, and you might get some forbs and weeds growing in there. So if there is a little bit of post thin herbicide application, you could possibly get 2 or 3 years of reasonable turkey use. If you're a hunting club, and you get in those stands and do a little corridor disking down those cut rows, you might encourage some forb and legume growth, in there for a short period of time until that canopy fully closes. But it's a little bit tough on that first thin part of the rotation, 14, 15 years old. When they do it the second time, if you get a second thin at, 22, 25, in that window, the trees are a little bit bigger. It opens it up a little bit more, and you might, be able to take a little bit better advantage of a little bit more open ground. And then you compare that to the wildlife guys that are doing a first thinning. We're probably still going to be cutting it back. One, we'll probably have that stand burned prior to thinning. So we don't have the fuel load and the trash build up right after the thinning. We don't have the sweet gums and the saplings and things like that growing in the stand that much. And so it's a little bit cleaner once it's done. We're probably not going to, we might cut it back a little bit farther than a 70 basal area. So maybe 10% less, 65 basal area, something like that. Maybe push that thin a little bit harder to get more sunlight, but I don't want to open it up too much because I'm worried about the next hurricane that comes up from the Gulf. And certainly, Mark, you run into a lot more than we do, where, those storms will blow down the first thin, and all of a sudden you've got, instead of 300 stems per acre stand out there, you got 100 of them, and that's not where you wanted to go that quick. So, we try and be a little careful on our first thins of not cutting it back too far, but because we've burned, we've got the advantage of, having a stand that's already kind of a little bit more open to work with in first place. So we get a little bit more benefit out of it. We're probably going to come back in and second thin it a little bit sooner as well, because all we're trying to do is get those trees to grow strength in their stems to withstand some wind, things like that, and then come back in and, second thin them pretty quick and get them where you got more of an open stand. And again, all you're doing then is just targeting, getting as far open as you need to get that sunlight and stuff like that. Something I always have a hard time convincing landowners that trees actually continue to grow. And I get this all the time is, this is the last time I want to thin these. And I'm like, it doesn't work like that. You can't stop them from growing. So we can thin them back as hard as you want, but those trees are still going to expand canopies and grow more needles and grow taller and grow thicker. So, that's just a matter of trying to work, within that system. But anyway, regardless, once you've done that, you may have a sweet gum issue. If you got a sweet gum issue, you can come in. We like to do a hand crew if possible, because it's targeted, and go out there and spray the sweet gum problems you might have. Some stands don't have them if they're good site prep. A lot of them don't have them. If you burned a lot, they may not have them as bad, but a lot of sites you get just this carpet of sweet gums after your first thin, and that's a good time to go in and treat them, get a burn on it. And then follow it up with a hand crew and do a little sweet gum, because again, the sunlight, as you guys know, sunlight's the factor, and it may not be your pine trees that are capturing all the sunlight. It may be that mid-story of sweet gums out there that are capturing all your sunlight, but something captures it all before it gets to the ground to grow that nesting cover and things that you're looking for.
Mm-hmm. So when you go in, you do the first thin, you wait a little while for the trees to become more wind firm, and then you come in and do your second thin. If you were on a property where turkeys were a management priority, what would you thin back to on that second thin? What basal area would you be looking for?
Of course, you get that question all the time too, and you get it when you're out dealing with landowners, and I hope you give the same answer I do. Is it all depends?
Yeah.
But it really does. So, when you get on a piece of property with somebody the first time, and you go into the first stand, they're like, "What should I do here?" And I'm like, "Look, I'm sorry, but I can't tell you anything right now. I'm not trying to keep it a secret, but I haven't seen the rest of your property. I might have seen an aerial photograph, but I don't know how this property lays out or what's over the
Mm-hmm.
next corner and that type of thing. So, the it depends thing is valid. So much depends on how that property's structured. How much open piney woods do you have? In an ideal scenario, I'm just kind of thinking on one of my, best properties I can think of that is incredibly diverse. We've got some 50 basal area pine stands scattered around that piece of property, various places of 20 to 50 acres in each. But then we've also got some stands that may be a similar age, but we didn't thin them back as hard because that's not where we wanted our quail woods. So maybe those are, 70 to 90 basal area. And then we've got some younger pine stands that would have been first thinned and, that's been 4 or 5 years now, and they're pushing 100 basal area. And we've got all these hardwood drains and, how that goes. I mean, diversify piece of property, the better off you are,
Mm-hmm.
the more diverse it is. And so, on the general rule, I guess, or trend on the first thin, we're shooting for that 70, that standard forestry thing in that ballpark.
Mm-hmm.
We've had some quail places that, come back in 3 and 4 years and thin it again. And then they're
Mm-hmm.
cutting it all the way back to a 40,
Mm-hmm.
which is a pretty darn heavy thin. It's pretty open. Now, amazingly, 5 years again down the road, that 40 basal area stand is now 80. It's amazing how fast they grow, and trees are trying to close canopy all the time.
Yeah.
From the turkey guys, it may be the first thin at 15, the next thin at 22, and we only cut it back to a 50 basal area.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a little taller tree. There's a little bit easier ability of the sunlight to penetrate under that canopy at an angle versus coming straight down. So the taller trees, I think, can handle a higher basal area and still get that sunlight on the ground than a shorter tree does that has a more full canopy and branches halfway up versus, it's a live crown ratio.
Yeah.
So that all makes a big difference. And, again, it's just adjusting that to the density of the understory you want in that particular spot. It is. Some places, the understory is too thick. I mean, the pine
Mm-hmm.
savanna of a 30 basal area quail place, it's not the greatest turkey habitat. I don't
Yeah.
mind having some of it, but I don't want a lot of it. I
Yeah.
want some shade to control some of the grass dominated understories you might have to, you might be running into.
Yeah. I
Quail
totally
woods are,
agree. It's like you can get to a point to where you don't have enough bare ground
yep,
because you've thinned it back so far because every square inch is occupied by some plant that's growing.
yeah. And grass dominated sites can be a bit of an issue trying to figure out, even with
Mm-hmm.
quail management, trying to figure out how best to control a broom straw stand that has become literally too thick, and you burn it on a regular basis and it's dominated by one species or maybe two species of grasses, and the forbs and legumes are struggling now. How do you deal with that? You put cows on it, you run a disc over it. Kind of hard to figure out, but you can manipulate that a little bit with overstory density. So those
Mm-hmm.
stands that are running a 70 or 80 basal area pine stand over top of it have that patchy, thick and thin. Broom straw's thick over here and it's thin under the trees, and kind
Yeah,
of
I mean
breaks it up a little bit.
that's one reason Marcus and I have said several times on here that variable retention harvest is almost like perfect for turkeys.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Where you have varying canopy cover as you go throughout a stand, and so some areas are a little bit more shady. They're going to have
Yep.
mature trees and everything that goes along with that, and then other areas are almost like a field, right? Which we know
Right.
turkeys use fields all the time too, and everything in between. Another thing I did want to mention real quickly that I'll oftentimes layer on when I get that same question that I just posed to you from a landowner is if they're on a smaller property or they're just happen to be in a market in an area of that market where it's difficult for them to move wood. In other words, it's difficult for them to actually sell the timber and have a logger come in and take it off. Then I'll probably recommend that they thin a little bit more intensively, take the basal area down a little bit lower when they can get that operation in there, because we can't count on necessarily getting them to come back in a few years to take
I
it down
agree
further
100%.
once it closes back up.
Yep. Yeah, there's some place in North Alabama that apparently folks are just struggling to get any thinning done,
Yes.
and it's getting harder and harder around here.
Yeah, I just met with the landowner and made that same recommendation in central Mississippi. So I wanted to ask you, Ted, a couple of things. One, since we've been talking about the variable retention, do you recommend or impose that on the logging crew uh, when when you're getting somebody in to cut ever?
Um, yeah, I mean, obviously, you're trying to get your logging crews to, you know, do the thinning the way you want it done. And so we're trying to work with them real closely. Um, there's some stands we're doing some marking where we're doing the, put the paint on
Yeah.
trees and get the stand where we want it. In a lot of cases, we're doing a little bit of marking and then working with the logger and letting them, operator select. And so
Mm-hmm.
we're particular about the loggers we work with. Most of the time when somebody's cutting on us, they've cut on us before. You get to know them. They're good guys. And, this particular logger's got this specialty and that particular logger's got that specialty. And so you try and, work with them, get them started and then monitor them, keep up with them as they're going along. So
Mm-hmm.
one of my things with the loggers I'm dealing with all the time is I'm look, because they have the mindset they want to have everything in rows and even spacing. So their first thins, they're all about density and spacing between trees. And I tell them, look, I'm, especially for our more wildlife oriented guys, say, look, we're more interested in the quality. I want the best trees out here, the ones that we need to leave. And you thin around those. And I don't care about thick and thin. So if you run into a patch of, that's got 20% Carnartium knots, or fork tops, just go ahead and thin that harder and open it up. And this area over here, that all the stems
Mm-hmm.
are, very even size and quality and they're nice and clean, leave that part a little bit thicker. And, it's kind of foreign to them, but if you can work with each, individual logger for, getting the stand the way you want it, most of the time it's not worth doing a whole lot of, effort on marketing and things like that because there's not much money in it for the landowner. There's not much money in it for the logger, and there's not much money in it for us, to do that kind of stuff because the timber
Mm-hmm.
markets are pretty poor. But if you want the stand to look right, you got to either pay close attention to the logger and keep them up to speed on what you're looking for, and or mark a lot of it.
Mm-hmm. The other question, which is a little bit still on topic, but we haven't discussed it yet. What about landowners that are not really interested in terminating the stand with a clear cut? Can they just continuously go back into stands and thin over time to keep it at the target basal area level and
Yeah,
just
that's always
continue
a
to include
fascinating
fire?
question, and we get it, quite a bit, not a lot.
I'm getting
Um,
it a lot more now.
Yeah, I mean, it's really that kind of gets you to, from our perspective, one of those challenges in management is how do we do, something we think is a pretty cool thing to do, but maybe not practice that often. There's obviously the easiest way, you went to forestry, I went to forestry school, and I mean, the easiest way is to plant them in rows and cut them at 35, and thin them
Mm-hmm.
once during that time frame. It's pretty simple and straightforward, and again, if you're working with these wildlife oriented guys who have an environmental interest and stuff like that, especially with longleaf, is then how do you not have to go through the clear cut process? So some guys are opposed to the clear cut just because visually, and some guys, is like, well, yeah, it's really not the way nature used to work. So, how can we work around it? So we played around with that, quite a bit on some different tracks. Certainly, if you're working with longleaf, I think it's pretty easy if you're doing the burning and things that go along with it. That's obviously the struggle with loblolly. You can go to a natural regen system with loblolly seed trees or something like that, but you got to keep fire out of it for a few years, certainly to allow those things to get jumping. But with longleaf, a lot of times you run into, we deal with it on some of the quail places that we work with, that is a loblolly or a slash pine stand, and you want to get longleaf growing back in, and you don't want to go through the clear cut process. So if you can cut those back to a very open 30 basal area, almost savanna type quail woods, you can come back in and scatter plant longleaf. And that actually works out very cool, where it starts to look like those dome type of plantings, and where the more open patches, grow up with the tall ones in the middle and the short ones on the outside, and then it goes, off where there's hardly any or low survival, the planting, and then it picks back up in these gaps and openings, or that's where you try and plant them, and then you can incorporate the fire right back in it on 2 years after you've done it. That's a really good way to do it. The guys.
So that's basically underplanting seedling.
Yes.
Longleaf within the.
Yeah. With some small maybe gap plantings. Is that great from a timber standpoint? No, it's terrible. Any logger down the road is going to go, why did you even think about doing this? But it can be done, and maybe 20 years down the road, we've got a little better markets, and and loggers are a little more specialty oriented. But the thing you tell folks all the time too, that that have an older loblolly stand that are kind of growing it on a quail woods, for instance, they don't want to clear cut, and you got to approach them and say, look, these trees can't live forever. All right, they get old, they die. Loblolly, maybe 60, 70, 80 years of age. They're just not going to make it much farther than that. And so you're going to have to figure out, do you want them all to die and you end up with this clear cut, looking thing that doesn't have anything in it? Or, how do we go about reforesting it? And two, the size of the trees, like we said before, get to a point where the mill's not going to take them anymore, especially old field type loblolly. It's got a lot of knots and limbs. Logger's not going to cut it. That might be a 30, 40 inch, but the logger's not going to cut it and the mill's not going to take it. And all of a sudden you're growing a whole bunch of trees that have no value other than aesthetics and, shade suppression on the ground cover. So, what do you do about those? And that's always a consideration. So, because most of these folks like the aesthetic look of a open, mature quail woods. With longleaf might be a little bit different because longleaf has a longer life and overall is generally not as limby, although I've seen some old field longleaf that are pretty limby, but mostly they're a little bit cleaner and straighter and taller and better looking in their older age classes. But they still get fat, big, and unless it's a specialty market, probably bigger than the mills will take. So you got to play that in consideration too. So how do you reforest that while you take those big fat ones out?
Yeah, I've seen several of these older plantations over the past several years where some of them even have their own logging equipment to go in and cut those trees, and they're not even selling them.
Yep.
They're just cutting those trees and leaving them on the ground or something or maybe, best case scenario that maybe they have a guy that's nearby that's got a portable sawmill or something like that, and he cuts it up for, nice furniture.
Yep.
But other than that, it's just like, yeah, sure. But other than that, that tree is just, eating sunlight. They can't go to the understory and there's no market for it. So, that's an extreme example, but it does happen.
Yeah. And you wonder sometimes is that the way maybe the market's going to go for some of those more specialty type things? Is there going to be, these loggers that operate off an hourly basis or something like that go ahead and, cut timber for folks and take it to these little small peckerwood mills and cut things up for flooring and decking and stuff that's just local. Yeah.
Right.
Well, you have to imagine too that, that old growth, so to speak, where, we've dwindled that down to very little of the existing tree base, but those trees are quite valuable for some of these specialty things, like, using for building materials or what have you.
Yeah, exactly.
So I start to wonder about whether or not that market will become more and more lucrative over time because those resources will be less and less available.
Yeah, there's not much of it out there.
So what about, it seemed like what you were describing with the underplanting was sort of a hybrid of an uneven aged management strategy. But that's something that has been talked about and practiced for quite a while in longleaf country, at least down in Florida.
Yep.
So can you describe, what that might look like and how that differs from from this more even age style of management?
Well, up here in our neck of the woods, and obviously you get down around Florida and South Alabama, people are a little bit more focused on longleaf, and you get around Montgomery and certainly north. We got some good longleaf sites, but there's not a whole lot of people that are managing from longleaf. Our quail folks or strictly wildlife folks have that interest enough to have longleaf as part of their management regime, and they run into that same scenario of not wanting to clear cut. So, and that's probably where we picked up most of it, is from the folks in South Alabama and Florida and stuff like that, and South Georgia, that have played around with doing it over time. Again, from a timber standpoint, the loggers, I mean, it's not a timber valuable way to manage it. We encourage folks to not plant 20-acre patches, for instance, clear cut less than 20 acres, because who's ever going to thin those? I mean, I have a hard time getting somebody to thin a 40-acre block. And so you got to play that consideration in there. But what we typically do on most of ours that we're playing that game is, get that thinning done and design it where we've got those patches of 5-10 acre openings with a thin pine kind of joining it all up. But certainly we're going to make sure we've got openings established on that stand, and they're joined up with thinned woods, 30 Maisler, let's say, to the next openings. And those are kind of scattered around. We'll go into those sites and do a little bit of herbicide work, because longleaf does not do well without some type of site prep. We'll go in with a hand crew, and if it needs it, apply a little arsenal, but if nothing else, it might just be some oust for weed control next spring, and a little bit of glyphosate or something to brown up the sites. And we'll kind of site prep those areas. It's going to be low intensity because we don't want to damage that understory and plants that we've got out there in the first place. But we do want to give longleaf an advantage for a couple months next spring. And generally, we'll probably try and burn that site as well. So if we've got to put a fire lane around it, get a fall burn to get the site cleaned up, and it's it's a site prep. It's not an intensive site prep, but it's still a site prep. And get the trees. We'll plant those again. We're probably doing almost all our longleaf on a 600 or so tree per acre planting density, because again, the nature of longleaf is they tend to thin themselves even before you ever run a commercial crew. From 0 to 20 years old, they thin themselves out quite a bit over time, especially if you're burning every 2 or 3 years. So we're still probably running a 600 tree per acre density, expecting 400 or 500 maybe at thinning time. And then the biggest issue we've run into, especially the quail folks who do the corridor cutting in the fall, of doing hunt trails, and they'll checkerboard with a mower. And if I can keep them off that for the first 2 years, then we can certainly have a much better looking stand. But it's it's tough. The guys on a tractor, and it's hard to see young longleaf out there. The first year they're going to mow over top of them, and the only one they're going to hurt is the ones that got under the tires. But the second and third year they start poking up, and they're not high enough to be visible by the tractor operator, and they're going to be chopping up a few of them. So what we try and, if we can, at minimum, try to widen those corridors out and get them to not mow quite as tight. And then after they're up pretty good, they can kind of meander around through them and see them. But anyway, they go under the same burner regime, 2-year, burner rotation. And over time, they look very cool. Again, I don't think they're the greatest timber production sites, but they look cool, and they fall well into a management regime. And turkeys are going to utilize that with a little bit thicker cover, as those longleaf kind of domes come up. There's spots where a little protected cover. There's probably not a whole lot of brood habitat associated with it, but certainly nesting cover and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the other things I wanted to make sure that we got in today too is a situation that I commonly run into, and I'm sure you do too, is, kind of to use Marcus's example from earlier. It's like you buy a new property or you inherit a property or something like that, and it's got probably loblolly plantation on it that has not been thinned yet. Let's just say it's 20, 25 years old and it's never been burned. So it's got, a sweet gum mid-story in it that is, 2/3 the height of the pine trees in it at this point. What can you do with that from a turkey habitat perspective?
Well, we kind of enjoy those.
Your approach to that?
Yeah, there's a lot of work involved in it, which is kind of fun. I mean, we enjoy doing. When you run into those sites, obviously, if you can get a logger to come in ASAP on a 20-something-year-old unthinned loblolly stand that's full of sweet gums, you do it. And you get them to, thin it out as quick as you can. That'll get the process started, which is we run into that all the time. And it's just a matter of getting the balls rolling and getting the process started on a piece of property and things starting to happen. So you start making the changes you're looking for. If it's 20 years old, those sweet gums are not going to be big enough probably to go on the back of a truck. So it's just a matter of thinning the pine out in there. We do run a couple of woodland mulchers and we bought them specifically for that reason. Because a lot of our landowners needed that mechanical clearing capability. And those things just, make a living off of that type of thing you just described. A stand that had a 20-foot tall stand of sweet gums in it, that whether it hadn't been burned or whatever the reason, the sweet gums filled in and got too big to handle by fire, that we can come in there and we can clear those things out, especially after a logger goes through. Logger takes out the pine trees, knocks down a bunch of sweet gum. We can follow back in behind that with the mulcher and clip all those things, put them on the ground, burn it again the next round, maybe a year or so later after that mulch has dried up some, get a fire through it, and then run the hand crew herbicide application through it. And that's a quick and dirty way to get that job done, of turning an unproductive stand of, shady, thick pine that's in rough shape and turn it around in 2 years. If you can get the logger, a little over 2 years, you've got a pretty good looking stand. It's starting to be productive. 3 years, it's real productive.
Right. Yeah. And I think one of the key things you mentioned there is the bringing the hand crew in aspect of it too, because you've got all that 20-year-old sweet gum rootstock that's sending resprouts up constantly.
Oh yeah.
So, trying to kill that 20-year-old rootstock with fire is an uphill battle, if not a fool's errand,
Yeah. And, we do, as you well know, a ton of burning and we've resigned ourselves to the fact that we're never going to control sweet gums with fire. You can keep them at bay, and we've got some stands where we, have a lot of gum and we just burn it every 2 years. Maybe the landowner didn't want to spend the money on it, or it's not that of a high priority. We burn it every 2 years in May, maybe every 3 years, but burn it in May or June and knock the tops off of them. But in general, we don't see a lowering of the density of those sweet gums over time, even with the May burns. It does top kill the stew out of them and it works really well, but there's, exactly the same number of them 2 years down the road when we're burning it again. And, we tell folks all the time, if you want to get rid of them, a good herbicide application, especially targeted herbicide application with the hand crews, is just highly effective, because they can go in and, spray that gum and they spray that gum, and it's just not a broadcast spray. And so if there's a place that has 500 sweet gums per acre, they may be broadcast. But if it's a place that's got 50 sweet gums per acre, they can spray that one and this one and that one, and not just, broadcast herbicides all over the ground, changing the vegetation structure.
Yeah, I mean, you and I had that conversation recently about you going to more hand crews for that reason, and I thought it would be overly expensive because of the labor involved in that compared to just like a skidder spray. But you were explaining to me that the reduction in the volume of chemical that is used helps out a little bit with that.
Kind of makes up for it.
Yeah,
it does. I mean, when you look at it, depending on the site, but they're very equivalent. And the broadcast spray, and the other issue I run into, I like a hardwood in my pine stands, and I love a pine stand. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'd rather manage one of those than a hardwood stand because they're easier. You can do more things in a pine stand, and I think has a lot of benefit. A good managed pine stand is much better wildlife habitat for year-round use than a good managed hardwood stand. Hardwood stands have limited windows of use. And, pine stands are used year round, but again, they got to be managed right. But I love having that structure visually, and I think from a wildlife perspective of that scattered post oak, white oak that's in a burned piney woods that can, those fire tolerant hardwoods growing out through there are beautiful. They throw some acorns on the ground in a pine stand, and there's a lot of value to them. And you start running a skidder out there with Arsenal. I mean, it's just amazing how easy it is to damage a great big hardwood with just a little bit of Arsenal.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's hard to kill a small sweet gum with Arsenal, but a big oak tree is incredibly susceptible to having Arsenal put anywhere nearby it. I've seen some, live oak line drives that were just wasted by, Arsenal that was 60, 70 feet away from it, sprayed in a field, It just got into dirt and killed these 200-year-old live oaks and stuff. So
it seems like you can just spill it and kill them.
Yeah. I would say you can shake a bottle of Arsenal at a big oak tree and wilt up and die.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it was made to do.
Yes, it was. It was very effective.
That's right. Yeah. So, I guess we've kind of covered most of early and mid rotation. We already even, started touching on late rotation some, but, I guess to close it out, can you speak specifically to that and the decisions? So we already spent a lot of time talking about maybe underplanting if you don't want to clear cut, but if that's not an option, when is clear cutting typically implemented in these scenarios we've talked about today?
Well, obviously the kind of the late rotation stuff is where, if you're managing for turkeys and wildlife perspective, the late rotation stuff is where you're trying to get to. That's where, you're enjoying the aesthetics of it and the wildlife value of it. And you might enjoy that for 20 something years, that late rotation. You might get a second, third, fourth in on some of these stands and, grow them out to an older age class. And, I think the best wildlife habitat out there is in those types of stands personally. I love a mature open piney woods, and I think it has good year round use and from poults to eggs to adult birds. But they all get old, and if you're dealing with loblolly, it's going to get older faster than longleaf, and you got to make some considerations for how do you regenerate it. We have that discussion with folks all the time. They look, the stand's getting older, which is kind of funny. My partner Bach is more forestry oriented. I'm more wildlife oriented of the two of us. So we have that debate all the time. And he's like, man, we need to clear cut that stand. It's getting too old. And I'm like, oh man, we need to keep that for 20 more years, and grow it out because it's pretty. And so, it's a standard debate, not only within our little group, but with our landowners we have to deal with. But they all, have to make that decision at some point in time. When that stand gets old, how do you want to do it? And most of them are satisfied with, look, just clear cut it, let's start it over. And then, then there's the discussion of, all right, so we want to clear cut this 50-acre mature stand. We're going to try and get the best money we can for it, clear cut it, clean it up, site prep it. We are, big on making sure the site prep is adequate for whatever trees we're planting. And then you have that discussion. What do we want to plant? Want to go with loblolly? You want to go with longleaf? Then that discussion about what density. Let's say, we're going with loblolly, but a lot of these industry stands now are going to a lower density. It's cheaper. It's hard to justify somebody financially to get involved in growing a loblolly stand when your timber markets are terrible. So instead of planting 600 trees per acre, should we maybe go into the 400 tree per acre loblolly and just do wider spacing? Equipment's getting bigger. The width of the tires on skidders and cutters now are bigger than they were 10 years ago and 20 years ago. So wider spacing between your rows is probably a good idea. And so, just all those decisions have to be made up front before you do anything. And then, the other thing that really applies with certainly new landowners, but even with the longer term landowners, when you clear cut that thing, you're working with a bare slate. So now you can do kind of whatever you want to do with it. So do we want to
Yeah,
establish some new fields? How do we
that's
handle
a
log
really good
index?
point.
Yeah, and I mean, I love the brand new slate thing out of it. And even on thinning operations, I've had landowners in the past that, you got log index, they're an acre or something like that. Oh, let's, we've got to go plant all those log index with pine trees. I'm like, no, we're not. Sorry.
Yeah,
It's just not going to work like that. But
Mhm.
we got all these new little fields out there. Why don't we just make ragweed fields out of all these and have this bugging ground? We're working a project in Coos County right now doing exactly that of, reverting all these old log index back into little quail fields or little ragweed brood fields for turkeys and quail chicks.
Mhm.
hmm
So just making use of them. But, again, you get the blank slate, you can, design how you want. If a landowner's not totally into it from a timber perspective and trying to make money off of it, you can corridor plant. You can plant some hardwood areas on the creek bottoms and establish new green fields, and then some areas nothing at all. Just burn them and keep them in broom straw. Open grassy areas. So those opportunities to create what you want out of a fresh clear cut are certainly beneficial.
Yeah, and one thing that I've been recommending more and more to landowners that are, especially wildlife focused and oftentimes even turkey specific focused is like you made a really great point. You don't have to replant every acre just because you clear cut it off. Like we don't have to replant all of that. But you also have options at thinning as well, where, just like we were talking about variable retention, you can also just cut lanes out through it if you're trying to improve connectivity across the property, or if you're trying to have some higher sunlight areas that are going to provide brooding right next to nesting. And we
Yep.
can do the same thing and carry that same logic on into the clear cut phase and recognize, especially like if this is a long linear stand that runs adjacent to one of my best hardwood bottoms on the property, and the turkeys tend to roost there, and they come up out of this pine stand into the rest of my property. Well, maybe I'm going to just choose not to replant a few corridors down the strip
Yep.
of that pine stand when I do reforest it, and then I can maintain that connectivity and even manage those lanes to provide something like brooding cover.
Sure.
Mhm.
Exactly.
Well, no, to add to that, one thing that I find myself recommending more and more now is to use the opportunity of when you have a crew in there cutting
hmm
to daylight your roads to,
Yep.
improve, potentially the road system itself, but the connectivity through the property certainly. And that often results in some area that you can maintain in high quality early successional communities.
Yep. No doubt.
Absolutely.
One thing I know we have at least two listeners because they have both asked me about this and I've talked to them about it. What about, in regards to not having to plant everything? What about clear cutting and then just not doing anything and letting it naturally revegetate?
Sounds
Have
like a
you
deer hunter.
talked? Well, they say they're turkey folks too. So,
We
but
run into that all the time, which you got to feel comfortable picking on deer hunters if you read Tom Kelly stuff. Um,
no, I feel very comfortable picking on deer hunters.
well,
You're not bothering me.
exactly. We're all the same. We're all got the same goal, and unfortunately, I got
Yeah.
to kill some deer every once in a while too. But so we run into that all the time with landowners. Oh, the deer like thick stuff, and let's grow some thick stuff. And I kind of like pretty open woods personally, but again, it's just kind of a personal thing. There's certainly benefits to thick stuff, but that's what you're gonna get if you clear cut something and just let it grow back. Generally, you're not going to get a good enough fire on it because the fuel base is going to be weak, and so it's going to end up being a thick, nasty spot. Now, if there was a little bit of herbicide work, where you encourage more of the broom straw, maybe you could get it to the point where you could carry good fire on it. And if that's the case, kind of something that's maybe a little woollier broom straw with some brushy thickets and stuff like that might have some benefit. But I like
hmm
yeah, I like putting stuff out there that allows you to kind of manipulate it and manage it a little bit better, even if that's pine strips. Now, if that's a 5 acre spot, then I could certainly see a lot more benefit into just not planting that compared to a 50 acre spot.
Right.
And
Mhm.
if it's just a small little patch clear cut, yeah, I could see some benefit as long as you keep fire on it and keep it under control.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
What are we missing?
Yeah. I was about to ask the same thing.
I mean, I think we've given it
Covered the
pretty
bases good.
pretty thorough coverage, pretty thorough treatment. Any other scenarios that we haven't covered, Ted, that you can think of that you commonly encounter with landowners?
Not off the top of my head, unless you suddenly delve into a whole new line of thing, which takes another podcast.
Yeah.
When we were talking about all this, I was thinking about the burn-in and burn-in structure of patch layout and stuff like that, and I'm like, yeah, that goes off a whole nother road onto another hour of discussion.
Sounds like we need to go ahead and schedule to have you back on then.
We do that in February in preparation for burn-in season in March. Get everybody
That's right.
fired up,
That's
so
right.
to speak.
Yeah, you reached out to me about that, and I was like, man, earlier this year, and you were like, man, this prime burning time right now. Like, why aren't you guys producing any content on that? And it just slipped by us. We already had, everything scheduled out during that period of time,
Yep.
and it just before we knew it, it was already gone.
I know how that works.
Yeah, it's also we're ramping up on during that time frame. People are starting to turn back to turkeys. Those that turned away, some don't.
Mm-hmm.
Those are our core listeners.
Yeah,
but we obviously have several topics at the peak of interest, and like Will said, we just ended up covering several things, and then I think we went a nice little stint there without even talking about fire.
Yeah, we did, which is surprising for us.
Yeah,
that's heresy.
It's pretty rare. Yeah. Well, Craig, on a recent episode, Craig Harper, at the end of it, he said, fire. I just wanted to bring that up because we hadn't talked about fire this whole time.
I like it. If you're going to talk about turkey, somehow you got to fit fire into it.
Oh, yeah. Well, and there's obviously a lot of interest in fire. I mean, I'd say the majority of things that I get invited to talk to, they're asking me to talk about fire, whether it's focused on turkeys or not. Usually it's focused on turkeys or at least game species, but it's always centered around the topic of fire, and I think there's good reason for that.
Oh, there's no doubt.
Really, really valuable tool, really important in the history of our landscape.
Yep, no doubt. I'll be doing a little bit of that this afternoon, I think.
Yeah, good.
Smoke some sweet gums.
How many acres have you gotten in this year?
We rolled over 10,000 about a week ago, so we're coming up on probably 11,000, something like that.
Pretty solid.
It is.
Pretty solid.
It is.
And the vast majority of that has been just you and Rob doing it together.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like probably 90% of it.
Nice.
That's getting it.
It is. It's getting after it, and I mean it's my favorite thing to do. And when you burn with somebody, as long as Rob, you called him Rob, now I called him Rob. When you burn as long as Rod and I have burned together, he's
not a turkey hunter, so he doesn't listen.
Exactly. I'm gonna make him listen to this podcast now. I'm trying to discourage him from being a turkey hunter, though. Can't have people too close to you to turkey hunt. I drove my wife off of it years ago. But yeah, it's like being an old married couple. I mean, you know what the other one's thinking all the time, which is really important when you're burning with somebody. And he knows where I'm up to, and I know what he's up to, and makes it pretty productive.
That's good.
Yep.
I wish I could be out there doing that much burning.
Yeah,
I have to live vicariously through her.
Well, it's really fun until it's not.
Yeah.
And then it's really not. So, thankfully, we don't have a whole lot of those. Knock on wood.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we enjoyed it, Ted.
Likewise. Yeah. Appreciate y'all having me on.
Really fun and informative discussion.
Yeah, this one's been a long time coming.
Yeah. And it addressed, several topic areas that are brought up consistently by our audience. And folks out there listening, if you have things that you want us to talk about, we have that survey linked in our show notes. If you haven't had a chance to voice those, you can do it there. We love covering topics that people want to hear about, especially things like this that could really move the needle for turkeys over a large portion of the landscape.
Definitely.
Good deal.
Yeah, so thanks, Ted, for your time. Thanks, everybody out there, for listening.
Enjoyed it. Appreciate it.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.